Written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman in 1890, The Yellow Wallpaper is a fictional book based around an unnamed mentally unwell woman who is undergoing what they called the rest cure, which was a Victorian version of therapy and an alternative to giving medication. Usually this was an option for the more upper-class individuals who could afford it. This treatment was coined and made by Silas Mitchell, whom was a very prominent and influential person in the medical universe at the time, and even still to this day. He majored his research in the nervous system and nervous disorders, and not just in the mental health sense, as he worked with veterans in the American Civil War, and it's him that we have to thank for the term phantom limb, and a lot of the foundational research on snake venom, nerve damage, and the effects of a gunshot wound. For all he's worth, he sadly has let down women with his research. His use of the rest cure definitely did more harm than help for women in the Victorian era. Two good examples of this are Charlotte Gilman and, unbeknownst to me, Virginia Woolf, whom both went through this treatment and speak ill of its effects. The rest cure consisted of a very strict regimen, lying flat in a bed with limited sitting up and no exercising. There was to be the most inactivity possible in the brain in order to help the nervous system to heal. So, this meant no reading, writing, sewing, and even no conversing with anyone else. In some situations, electrotherapy was used to, quote, calm the nerves. As well as all that, there was a strict diet of fatty foods to help redden and fatten up women, although I'm still not entirely sure why this was important. The idea was to take every single possible stressor or exciter out of the equation in order to create a total calm, and thus eradicating anything to be anxious or depressed over. This would carry on for 6 to 8 weeks, if not longer, and normally in the patient's own home, but in rarer situations it could have been held at facilities. It was prescribed to women whom had traits of hysteria or a nervous breakdown, what we would call nowadays as anxiety, depression, postpartum or psychosis, and so forth. Sometimes it was given to women for simply disobeying the husband, because surely she must not be right in the head in order to do something as unhinged as that. Which adds another power dynamic to it that men had over women. Women were punished under the guise of being helped. It was part of the patriarchal society that they lived in. You had to trust that the men knew best, let alone a male doctor of high standing. White women were subdued to this in order to go back to their daily domestic life after giving birth, whilst pregnant, or even as deemed as mentally fragile. But women of colour were not offered this treatment, and rarely even considered for it, as their nervousness or hysteria was thought to be from societal issues like poverty. Again, due to the time period, it's not surprising that racism was prevalent, especially in America and England. It's worth mentioning here that there was a similar technique used for men in mental distress, but by similar I mean very much the better of the two, but similar in thought process. It was called the West Cure, which consisted of every single thing the women's rest cure didn't. It was encouraged that men go out west, into the outdoors, and partake in vast numbers of activities. For example, hunting, horse riding, cattle roping, and bonding with fellow male peers. It was thought of that men needed an outlet to get it out of their system rather than to have calm. Silas Mitchell even attended these West Cure retreats and said that they helped him. Another big thing to point out about this was the suppression of women's freedom to write and create, whilst men were, in comparison, encouraged to write about how they felt and their day-to-day dwellings as part of getting better, and in hopes of making men intellectually stronger. And me saying all this isn't to take away from Gilman's suffering and to put the focus back onto a man when the book is bringing light to women's mistreatment, but I do think it's important to have a slight background before we get into the book. The book explores one specific person's perspective of this treatment, and it's a very interesting and somewhat unsettling read. I highly recommend this book to different people, but sadly, it's more than a book. So many people were subjected to this incarceration in their own homes, unable to have any freedom at all and kept in a state of being mentally unwell. The author of this book, Charlotte Gilman, actually fell victim to the very doctor who created this cure. She went through one treatment with him and subsequently never got treated by him again. She mentions that her room never had any windows and was dark. She believes that she was kept in a basement of sorts. She was denied any visitation from anyone, including her own daughter. She was given weak shock therapies to, quote, calm her nerves, and her diet was also only consisting of bland and not nutrient-dense food, primarily eggs and milk and various vegetables and broth. And if you really think about all that she endured, there's also the physical health impact that is not mentioned enough. Blood clots and sores can form from laying down in the bed for prolonged periods of time. And I saw someone else mention that muscle fatigue and weakness from lack of movement would form too. But Charlotte isn't the only famous female author to go through this treatment. Virginia Woolf, the writer of Mrs. Dalloway and Orlando, also went through quite a traumatic ordeal. She was subjected to England's version of the rest cure, but it was all relatively the same process. She criticises the treatment in her diaries and through her book, Mrs. Dalloway. The theme of oppression against women has been a recurring issue throughout history, especially when it comes to medicine, but I'm grateful that these women spoke out and became advocates to eradicate the treatment altogether. Normally I would sum up chapter by chapter, but I don't want to delve too deep into the story of this because I genuinely feel like you just need to read it. It's short enough that I feel most people can do that. In some editions, it's as little as 30 pages long, and there are also plenty of audiobooks online for those who struggle to read. You could also try YouTube. But essentially, we have a woman who has given birth recent enough to have a baby. She's residing in a house outside of a town centre, and she's occupying it with her husband John, her baby, and her husband's sister Jenny, who's taken up the role of nurse and housekeeper. Her husband is a doctor and one that is reputable. He's treating her himself, presumably with the techniques that he's learnt from other scholars, and this includes the rest cure and tinctures. You can tell that there's a slight power imbalance from the get-go, as you can tell by the way she talks about him. She says, John is a physician, and perhaps, I would not say it to a living soul of course, but this is dead paper and a great relief to my mind, but perhaps that is the reason I do not get well faster. You see, he does not believe that I am sick, and what can one do? If a physician of high standing and of one's own husband assures friends and relatives that there is really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression and a slight hysterical tendency, what is one to do? My brother is a physician and also of a high standing, and he says the same thing. So I take phosphates, or phosphites, whichever it is, and tonics, and journeys and air and exercise, and I am absolutely forbidden to work until I am well again. The way she talks about her husband is as if though he is better and of more worth than her. He must know better than her, even about her own mental health. She's denying her own thoughts and feelings about her treatment because she believes that he knows better, as that's what he's been telling her, and presumably also her brother has been telling her. It was right for the time period for men to be seen as smarter and more capable than women. Our narrator describes this house to be in a beautiful area, with a stunning garden and shrubbery. Their bedroom is at the top of the house, though she would prefer it to be downstairs where she could open the patio doors into the pretty garden and soak up the niceties. But John refuses this and basically says that he knows what's best for her and is to be cooped up there where nothing can excite her. The room used to be a nursery or a boys' gymnasium room, which she guesses because the windows have bars on them. But she notes that the wallpaper is ugly and she can't stand it, quoting, "Sprawling flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, but pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. And when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions. The colour is repellent, almost revolting, a smouldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded out by the slow turning sunlight. It is a dull yet lurid orange in some places and a sticky sulphur tint in others." And if you think about it, being made to look at something like this at all hours of the day with little else to do would drive you crazy. It's worth mentioning another added aspect to Victorian wallpaper is that a lot of times it contained arsenic or rarely sulphur, but both of which gave off a yellow hue. As we progress, we notice that she really focuses in on this wallpaper. I mean, there's nothing else permitted during the rescue. She speaks about how she looks at it trying to follow the pattern. She tries to find a start and finish. She even imagines herself within the vines at one point. But it slowly declines from innocent daydreaming, like many people do, into her straight thinking that there's someone stuck behind the wallpaper, within the vines. She starts to rip and pull up the wallpaper to try and help this person escape. Completely convinced that they can only be seen at night, she tries to help while John is asleep next to her. And as I pointed out earlier, things like arsenic and sulphur tend to have a physical effect on the body and brain. Being in a room with those chemicals, let alone touching them, are no doubt going to make you even more unwell. Jenny even mentions at one point that she keeps finding yellow stains when she washes our narrator's clothes and sheets. The narrator begs her husband to let her have visitors. She speaks about how lonely she is and wishes that John would be home more often. She constantly needs to hide the fact that she's been journaling and she finds it exhausting to keep it such a big secret. But nor Jenny nor John give in to her, and she's forced to suffer in that room alone. It really is a devastating story, and when you learn it was real for so many women in the Victorian era who were already struggling with their mental, it's actually very sad. She descends into this psychosis, and I'll be honest with you, it's a very bizarre read, and I can't even describe it or do it justice in a summary. When I say that I can't do it justice, I mean I can't explain how well it's written. If I was to quote something strange from the end of the book, it would sound weird and not as creepy as it was to read it, as all the book prior has built upon itself to create this really eerie experience. It makes you almost feel as though you were there with her, slowly spiraling into this psychosis. You're not entirely sure where the line between reality and truth are, or if it's even possibly supernatural. My key food for thought points on this. In my opinion, one reason why she's unnamed is because she applies to every woman that went through the rest cure and endured being patronised and silenced by men. Her ambiguity allowed women in the Victorian era to see themselves in the narrator. It's the same as Mrs. Dalloway from Virginia Woolf, where many women liked the book as it was a very feminist point of view and critiqued how men were towards women. Women meant nothing to men. Men didn't care about the emotional well-being of women realistically. They were objects to do domestic chores, not people, hence the lack of a main attachment to our protagonist. Upon my research after reading this book, I watched someone point out something that I didn't even consider whilst reading this book, and that's the idea that John is in fact not her actual husband, but rather her physician. The idea that the narrator is in some type of mental institution rather than her house. It would make sense for the time period in which it was written. There's bars on the window, a strict regime of doing nothing at all. Jenny comes in to check on her a lot, almost as a nurse would. Her family coming to visit, but only when John allows. And the fact that we never actually see our main protagonist hold her baby, always mentioning it in another room, makes me wonder if that's something that the doctors kept telling her to keep her calm. We know it's a common practice back in the 1800s to treat women like they were hysterical and to treat them like they were fragile beings that dare not be troubled with anything even minor, treating them or acting as if this fantasy of a perfect life is happening and everything is perfect and fine. A lot of people speculate that she particularly had postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis, which is a valid assumption, but what if rather she possibly lost the baby, and that's what could have led her into the spiral and denial where she truly was, creating this false narrative that John was her husband, the baby was safe in another room, and Jenny was the husband's sister, when in reality John was the doctor, Jenny was the nurse, and she was being held in a facility. The book is well known, but not well known enough for my liking. If you like thrillers, eerie books, or even horror, I suggest you read it. I mean, after all, what's more horrific of a theme than an abusive, neglectful man and mental insanity? This book helped discredit and ultimately shut down the rest cure that plagued women in the 1800s. It spread awareness and created room for practitioners to listen to women's feelings. Gilman eventually went on to write multiple essays about the book, and she explains in her own experiences with the rescue and why she wrote the yellow wallpaper. The book allowed many women to refute getting this treatment and opt for other things like medication or faith or retreats, rather than this obtrusive oppression on our ability to be creative and free. Gilman was born in 1860 in Connecticut, America, and died in 1935 after being diagnosed with cancer and subsequently committing suicide. During her life, she was an activist for labour workers, challenging women's place in society and general feminism. She was a suffragette, and she co-founded the Women's Peace Party in 1915 with Jane Addams, who won a Nobel Prize for her ideology of peace. Charlotte bared one child and had 2 marriages, and was quite known to suffer from mental depression. To me, she's a very important person to know about and research if you're into feminism. I rate this book a 5 out of 5. I do recommend it to many people, and I have little to complain about in terms of plot or how it's written. It's written in a very poetical but easily understandable way. It creates tension and atmosphere perfectly. I would give a lot to read this again for the first time.